Now, as you know, I'm sure there's a Conservative government in the United Kingdom. It's a coalition government with the Liberal Democrats, but the Tories are the majority party. And many people would suggest that the Secretary of State for Education, that's the main minister there, the man in charge of education, Michael Gove, and I would agree with this, is one of the most impressive people in British politics. He joins me from London right now. How are you, sir?
Very well, Michael. Pleasure to be on your show.
Thank you. Now, let's talk a little about education in the context of what we saw recently, the rioting in England, which I think came as a major shock to many people in North America. We have a fairly romanticised view of Britain. You can't rebuild or build a society without a good education. As the minister in charge, what are you doing to make sure, at least from the educational point of view, that rioting is at least unlikely?
Well, those riots, I think, shocked not just people looking across the globe, but many of us in Britain. But actually, the roots of what went wrong, I think, were visible to many of us. One of the problems with education in England for many years now has been a fundamental lack of equality of opportunity. We have some excellent schools, world-famous schools, both the private schools, the Eatons and the Winchesters, but also some superb state schools. But it's also the case that there are some poorer parts of our major cities where the standard of education has really been low for far too long. Children leave school at the age of 16 or 17 with few qualifications, and in many cases some of those children have actually opted out of formal education in their teenage years, and they're ripe for recruitment by street gangs and others. It's a situation that will be familiar to anyone who's seen what's happened in America's major cities, and what we're seeking to do is to ensure that those children who are in the weakest schools have the discipline, the rigour and the leadership on offer from a new generation of schools which will help turn their lives around.
Mm-hmm. But, Minister, we've had rioting here of a different nature, but we have had rioting particularly in British Columbia, in Vancouver, and the majority of people there, and they were trying to set fire to cars, and there was terrible violence that went on. They were in no way victims of society, and many of them were actually at university.
Well, one of the striking things about the riots here is that while there were a significant number of people who were clearly opportunistic and joined in when they saw a chance to subvert law and order and to and essentially engage in shopping with violence, the majority of those who were involved were people whose criminal past has been recorded by the courts when people have appeared. It's often been the case that they've been individuals who've had quite a significant criminal record going back several years. There's a sense in which to call these riots is something of a misnomer. It was a breakdown of law and order, which meant that the criminal elements in society had an opportunity to loot at will. And one of the striking things about the criminal elements in English society is that many of those people are individuals who've grown up in broken homes, without an appropriate authority figure, without a father to give them a proper sense of self-discipline and self-restraint at an early age. And they're often individuals who've gone to schools which have not had the tools or the wherewithal to instill an appropriate sense of discipline. And it's therefore been the case that these are broken children who grow up into young men who believe that they have nothing to lose because they haven't been given this sort of moral scaffolding that allows them to tell right from wrong adequately. Mm-hmm.
Let's talk a little bit about structure and authority and discipline, because these words have been anathema in educational circles for many years, both in the United Kingdom and in North America. And in Canada, we have a more stable society, I would argue, than in Britain. But still, there are some breaks and cracks emerging. And there are many teachers, or particularly educational bureaucrats, who are very frightened to talk about yes and no, absolutes and lines being drawn. Now, from what I know of you, you're someone who actually thinks this is a very good idea, but you've been criticised for that.
We have been criticised. I think you're absolutely right, Michael, because you put your finger on a debate which lots of Western nations, Canada, America, England, and of course Australia and New Zealand have had in education. And that's a debate between those people who believe, essentially, when you're confronting the problems that our society has, do we need therapy or discipline? Mm-hmm. Do we need moral relativism or the reintroduction of some moral absolutes? Do we need to say that there is a body of knowledge which has been passed on to us from previous generations, the best of what's been thought and written, that it's our duty to pass on to the next generation, or is that just a collection of prejudices assembled by dead white males? Well, I'm very firmly of the view that we do need discipline, that we do need authority, and that we do need to pass on that knowledge to the next generation. And I'm very firmly of the view that discipline in the years up until someone becomes an adult actually liberates them later on to be able to make the choices which are genuinely fulfilling. Whereas if you bring up a child in an atmosphere of license, then what you do is that you end up making them a slave to their passions rather than someone who's genuinely free.
Last question, not about education, but about conservatism. We've just had an election in Ontario, in Canada, where the Conservative Party was so desperate to not appear in any way conservative, and they lost quite badly. The Liberals won again. Now, conservatism has changed in Britain. You're no longer a Thatcherite party, but you're considered very much a conservative figure within that party. The British Conservative Party is in power only just. Is it still a Conservative party, or have you become part of the mainstream, part of the middle?
I think we're still a Conservative party, absolutely. And indeed, one of the things that struck me about Stephen Harper's success in Canada is that he succeeded in eclipsing the Liberals in Canada by being someone who's not afraid to argue for a set of propositions which are distinctly conservative and which chime with the common sense of most Canadian voters. Here, I think that the challenges that we're facing are similar to those that Canada and the United States have faced when it comes to dealing with our debt crisis, or dealing with the problems in education, or in particular, dealing with the welfare dependency that so many people in English cities are sunk in. Then the sorts of answers that we come up with reinforce what Margaret Thatcher once argued, which is that the facts of life are conservative. People want to see schools with good discipline and an emphasis on knowledge. They want to see a welfare system that encourages people back into work, and they want to see an answer to this debt crisis, which makes the virtues of thrift, enterprise and hard work the hallmarks of our economic approach.
Marvellous stuff. Michael Gove, thank you so very much indeed.
Not at all. Thank you.